I want to talk about plant selection. Lisa also mentioned there's many different names that these systems go by. I'm right here saying stormwater capture systems to be pretty inclusive, but largely it's biofilters or rain gardens that I'll be talking about. So if we go to the next slide, both Lisa and Jennifer did a nice job of setting up a lot of the things that I want to talk about in my talk about plant selection. But if we just look at this sort of typical biofilter, it's very obvious that the vegetation is important, right? So people, just by the nature that it's a biofilter, the thing that you see there is the plants. And so what I want to talk about in my talk is just how do we decide that we're going to have those plants, and who decides that, and what are the right things that we should be thinking about when we're making those decisions. So right now, what's happening when people select vegetation is it's usually done by landscape architects as part of a design team. And if you try to understand how they picked the plants that they picked, you'll find that there's generally not clear criteria. They're virtually never stated, whatever the criteria are, and it's a pretty, if you talk to them, it's a pretty simple decision that they're making, and that they're really trying to match the plant to the site conditions. So depending on what the soil's like or what kind of moisture regime you can expect, they're trying to pick plants that will live there. Another thing that you see many times is that they want, whoever's giving guidance suggests that it's good to have native species or at least climate appropriate species. Again, that's trying to make sure that they match the site conditions. And then we often find, especially here in Southern California, that irrigation is used. Ideally, we'd like to have plants that didn't require irrigation during the dry season. So there are some guidelines out there, and this one that Monash University put together for the Western Australia area is, perhaps the best example. It's certainly the best example I've been able to find in terms of going through and laying out the issues that you should be choosing your plants based on, things like nutrient removal or what the hydrologic features are going to be and things like that. And so this is a guide book which runs through many of the issues that I think are important, although you'll see even this book doesn't cover everything I think is important. But when you look at other guidebooks, they tend to be not nearly as thoughtful as that, and pretty much reflect what I said in the beginning, and that there might have a list of plants. Oftentimes it's like wetland plants because they're thinking about very wet stormwater systems, even though many of our biofilters aren't really that close to wetlands. They're mostly dry much of the time, or at least not in saturated soils. And so they might have some lists. Oftentimes there's no criteria for what it took to get on the list, and no evaluation of what the valuable characteristics of each plant species is. So what I want to talk about today are some of the things that I think we should be considering when we choose plants to go into these systems. And so there's a couple of categories here, and I'll go through briefly each of these. And the first one is we want to make sure that we get the functions that we're targeting. So largely that's pollutant removal in terms of plants. The biofilters themselves, we're also talking about stormwater capture. And then there's practical considerations like how they might influence maintenance or how they influence aesthetics. And then there's co-benefits that I want to talk about. So ecological functions and values and ecosystem services, and Lisa and Jennifer both talked about these things, and so there'll be some overlap here. So in terms of the target functions for pollutant removals, there have definitely been some studies that have looked at how specific plants differ in their ability to remove pollutants. And so here's just some examples of the papers that are relevant to this. And I have on the left, the lower left here, that graph shows nitrogen removal with different species. The blue bar, or the envelope at the top, is Carex. The tan one is Melaleuca, and the dark green one is all the other species. And you see Carex is the best over time in terms of the highest nitrogen removal. Melaleuca starts out lower but reaches up close to Carex, and the other species are actually worse in the sense that they're releasing nitrogen as opposed to removing nitrogen. So there's clearly species differences here. And similarly, on the graph over the right, to the right, we just see how two different species influence the conductivity, the ability of water to move through the biofilter media. And there's some other studies too that I'm not summarizing here. One thing, oh well, and then this is just a summary. Emily Payne did a really nice, thorough, critical literature review about plant selection for nitrogen removal. And I've just put here on this slide her summary, which, in summary, effective plant species for biofilter nitrogen removal are likely to be characterized by moderately high growth over long time frames, an extensive, dense, and deep root system, moderately high proportion of fine roots, relatively poor quality litter, an ericoid or ectomycorrhizal association, and active growth across much of the year. And then she points out that these traits are contradictory across plant strategies, and so some sort of trade-off is required in plant selection. So that's a pretty good summary, I think, of where we stand in terms of the characteristics of plants that we'd be looking for at least nitrogen removal, and it's similar for other sorts of pollutants. The thing I want to end with when I'm talking about these target functions is that although I'm summarizing some studies, if you're sharp, you might notice that they are all coming from University of Melbourne or Monash University. And although other people in the world have done some studies like this, not very much. So by far, the epicenter of this kind of work is right there in Melbourne. And what that means is, even though we know something about plant selection for the performance of pollution amelioration or pollutant removal, we don't really know that much, and we don't know that much about the species that are occurring in other parts of the world. So we're doing some work at UCLA to look at California native species, and so there's other work that needs to be done before we can really understand what are the species that we should be recommending just for this target function. If you go to the next slide, slide 9 now, sorry I haven't been telling you when to advance. I want to talk now also about practical considerations, and the two things that I really want to talk about are maintenance and aesthetics. And so the maintenance, these are really practical because they influence how different stakeholders view these biofilters. The maintenance in terms of who is responsible for them to continue to function. Sometimes it's a public agency, sometimes it's private parties. Either way, the maintenance is very important if we're going to expect these biofilters to perform appropriately over time. And then the aesthetics, we've already had some discussion about aesthetics and the fact that we need to make sure that these look nice so that people will want to look at them. So if we go to the next slide, to slide 10, I just have an example here. This is just an illustration of some of the issues that we need to think about in terms of maintenance, because this is Elmer Avenue, which is sort of the poster child for green streets in Southern California, and clearly a really good design, really thoughtful, and a lot of effort went into constructing this green street. And in 2011, a little bit after it was constructed, you can see the pictures up on the upper right there, 2010 and 2011, and the report was plant survival was high, sediments, there were some problems with sediments, and there were some bare spots, but in general, the biofilters looked good. When you go out now, and I have some pictures from 2013, clearly there's been some maintenance issues. Some of the biofilters have sedimented in, so there's not really much capacity now, like the one on the lower left there. And then there's also been issues in terms of plant survivorship. And so this is a challenge for us to try to pick plants. So obviously plants are not the only part that is related to maintenance, but we would like to try to pick plants that will minimize the maintenance of the biofilter. So if we go to the next slide, slide 11, the design is a big part of it, not even having to do with the plants, but we can select plants that could reduce maintenance. So one issue with biofilters is that the hydraulic conductivity can drop off through time as the filter media sort of clog. And so there are plants that have thicker, deeper roots that can help increase that hydraulic conductivity, or at least maintain it. Now here's one of these examples of a trade-off, in that those plants typically don't have the same dense small root system that is associated with high pollutant removal. And so in this case, it's probably an example of a complementarity thing where we have more species in there with different features like thick, deep roots versus shallow, fine roots. We get the set of functions taken care of that help maintain the biofilter over time. And then another issue with the plant species is that sometimes in some places the main material that needs to be removed from the biofilter in order to maintain it is the material that comes from the plants, the leaf litter. And so there are some plants that will produce more leaf litter, or more leaf litter that clogs the biofilter than other plants. And so we might be able to pick plants that minimize the leaf litter. And again, there's a trade-off there in that leaf litter actually has an ecological function. It can support invertebrate species, and it can provide some modification of, say, soil temperatures or moisture or something like that. And so again, there's a trade-off here and between the maintenance and the ecological functions. And then in terms of maintenance for watering, what we would like to choose is species that can survive without supplemental water. One of the issues in the pictures I showed from Elmer Avenue was that the water, initially those were watered not by the residents, but then it came time for the residents to provide the supplemental water to keep those plants alive, and they had to also provide the plumbing to do that. And so many residents obviously did not supplement the water, and so the plants died. So if we had plants that didn't require that additional irrigation, then the biofilter would have maintained its functions and appearance for a longer time. If we go to the next slide, slide 12, there's also an issue of aesthetics. And so I have to say, when I first started thinking about this, I really didn't appreciate the importance of aesthetics here, because I was all focused on ecological functions and also pollutant removal. But all you have to do is walk out to biofilters that look like this top one here, and you see that they're in highly visible locations. They're in the middle of streets or along the sides of streets, and so the residents and people who are passing by see these, and if they're not aesthetically pleasing, they're not going to be happy about it, and so that may hinder their acceptance by the public. And in addition, in an attempt to keep them aesthetically pleasing, people may be planting plants that are not optimal for biofilters. And so what you see here are the pictures. They're both Elmer Avenue pictures. The one on the top is one that wasn't really maintained. The one on the bottom is somebody on the corner who clearly takes great pride in the yard and the biofilter, and has done a lot of work in maintaining the biofilter and keeping it looking nice, but also has put in some other plants that were not the plants that were originally included there. And it's not clear whether those are good plants for the function of the biofilter or not. If we go to the next slide on 13, Jennifer also talked about co-benefits here, so I want to talk about the benefits that can come from biofilters, even though they're not the main reason we're constructing them. We're mainly constructing them to capture stormwater and to treat it, to remove pollutants. But we have ecological functions and values that also could come from these, and we have ecosystem services. Right now, I don't know of any cases where these co-benefits were a factor in plant selection. I haven't seen anything where anybody paid attention to these, and they're rarely mentioned, and they're certainly not quantified, but I think they're potentially very important, and they're things that we should be thinking about. So if we go to the next slide, slide 14, this is just an example of some of the ecological functions and values that biofilters might provide. Lisa talked a lot about biodiversity and some of the ecological theories relating to biodiversity. They provide species habitat for plants, vertebrates, and invertebrates. The plant part is obvious, but the vertebrates and invertebrates is probably not obvious to most people, but they still could be very important. And then both Lisa and Jennifer talked a little bit about connectivity, and particularly in our urban environments, the connectivity function that biofilters could play a role in could be super important, because otherwise those habitats are very fragmented. And I just wanted to put a plug in here for the importance of using native plant species. Obviously, you don't have to have natives, and you can pick other climate appropriate species. One thing about the natives is that they are more likely to be adapted to local climate, and in particular, they're more likely to be able to tolerate seasonal rainfall in the parts of the world, like in the Mediterranean climates, where we have these very long dry spells. And so it's possible that you can maintain non-natives looking good throughout the year, but most likely you're going to need supplemental irrigation for that, which provides its own sort of costs and obstacles. And then the other, probably the biggest advantage of native plant species is they're more likely to support native biodiversity. And so it's not that non-natives can't provide ecosystem services or provide some biodiversity support, but we get better benefits if they're native plant species. We get better biodiversity benefits in terms of providing habitat for native species. And then here's just one example of a study looking at biodiversity in biofilters. It's one example, but it's practically the only example. This study by Kazemi et al. Down in Australia. And what you see here is they studied different types of green spaces, bioretention swales, or like gardens, or just lawns. And what the graph shows is that the number of insect species, there's different aspects of biodiversity that they looked at in this study, but this graph shows the number of insect species being much higher in the bioretention swales, even than sort of a garden bed type of green space, and way higher than the lawn type of green space. So there's some indication of the benefits to biodiversity that these habitats could provide, although the data are really, really limited here. And then finally, I want to end by talking about ecosystem services. Jennifer did a great job of introducing the concept of ecosystem services, what they mean. I've listed here some ecosystem services where it's not by any means a comprehensive list, but I wanted to break them up into two groups. So there are ecosystem services that we specifically are planning biofilters for. So we are trying to regulate runoff, and so we're trying to reduce flooding and to increase water quality improvement, to recharge groundwater, or perhaps to increase our water supply. So these are all designed in, specifically planned for the biofilters. But we have all these other ecosystem services that they likely provide to a greater or lesser extent. We have a series of services that are related to the ecological values I just talked about, so supportive biodiversity, wildlife habitat, pollination. Also things like climate and temperature regulation, which I think especially in urban settings might be a very important feature. Carbon sequestration, and then a set of cultural ecosystem services. And these are typically much harder to quantify, certainly to monetize, but may end up being particularly important for the stormwater capture systems. And so we have aesthetics. There have been, some indication that these biofilters can increase property values, and so that would be I would put that in as an aspect of aesthetics. And then we have recreational benefits and educational benefits. I didn't put in research, but research benefits there also. One thing that I also wanted to just mention as a speculation here is potential health effects. So it's really not, biofilters have not really been studied for almost any of these ecosystem services. And probably the closest is work that's been done on green spaces. And so, especially in urban settings, it's not so much wetlands that is the comparable landscape type, but green spaces like parks. And there's a lot of issues in all of these studies, a lot of difficulties, but there's really a growing body of literature that is showing that green spaces are providing substantial health effects. And so I'm summarizing from one study here, which just lists out this set, I'm on slide 18 now, lists out this set of potential health benefits that come from green spaces. At the bottom, these authors are identifying natural biodiversity and biodiversity supported ecosystem services as being the root of all those benefits. But we know that living in greener environments now is associated with better mental health and lower mortality and other aspects of health. So this is an area where I don't think we can do anything right now to quantify potential health benefits of biofilters, but I think we should be thinking about this. And again, the types of plants that we choose could have an influence on how these biofilters are influencing health. Okay, so the next slide, slide 19. One definite obstacle to understanding really many of these ecosystem services, but especially this potential health benefit, is the fact that lots of these biofilters are very small. So this is a picture of biofilters from Hope Street in downtown Los Angeles, and you can see they're there. They're apparent, but they're small. And so that means that they're definitely not going to be suitable for habitat for larger wildlife. You're not going to get any coyotes or mountain lions living in these biofilters. But also it means that, some of these other benefits, some of the other ecosystem services like climate moderation or the health benefits I just mentioned are not likely to be very substantial in like a single biofilter system like this one. However, the scale of what we're talking about potentially implementing is actually very large, and so a large network could provide substantial benefits. So if we go to the next slide, this is just one map from an enhanced watershed management plan. So in Los Angeles, all the watersheds, almost all the watersheds and most of the municipalities are participating in these enhanced watershed management plans to try to figure out how they're going to manage their stormwater and keep the pollutants out of the receiving waters, the streams and the ocean. And what's important here is to see in this plan, they're identifying their opportunities for green streets. And that's in green. And if you look, this is the Bionda Creek watershed. If you look at that, there's a lot of green there. And so it's unclear how much of that will be built out in green streets. But when you're looking at this sort of landscape scale and thinking towards the future of the next 10 or 20 years when these things will be built out, I think that a lot of the benefits that I was talking about are more likely to occur, even though the individual projects might be small. Okay, so in conclusion, the choice of plant species can have a major influence on the performance and benefits of stormwater capture systems. Right now, when plants are selected, they virtually are never considering the things that I talked about here. A little bit of maintenance maybe, beginning to worry a little bit about what species actually will provide better function, although there's not much data on that. So although I think those are very important considerations, they're rarely factoring into the biofilters as they're currently being constructed. And so really, they have large information needs in every area, not enough studies to really tell us the information that would help us optimize the plant selection. And then I also want to emphasize again that the stormwater capture systems could provide important ecosystem services and ecological values, and we should be including this in our designs, both on individual projects, but especially we should be thinking about the regional scale that these will be going in. And so if we make the right decisions about what plant species we're putting in individual projects, that can have big benefits when we build them out to the region. And that's all I have. So thanks very much. And I guess I can ask if anyone has any questions.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
So the idea of health benefits is really intriguing. I wonder about health hazards. Like, do we know anything about whether the plants in biofilters promote allergy? You know, people are very sensitive to what plants produce, the way of pollen and things. Do we know anything about that?
No, I don't think. Well, I haven't seen anything about that, but it's definitely a concern. I ended up on the very last slide there showing a bunch of grasses, right? I mean, there's other things in there too, but there's grasses, lots of grass pollen. Lots of people are allergic to grass pollen, and so that's definitely a possibility. But on the other hand, plants can remove air pollutants, and especially in urban settings, you know, those are leading to high asthma incidences, especially among children and things like that too. So yeah, there definitely, I think it's certainly interesting to think about possible hazards.
That introduces like a whole new field of biofilter health, biofilters and human health.
Right. I mean, I've never heard anybody talk about it, but especially since I'm in a school of public health, I'm hearing a lot about health benefits of green spaces. Now, in those green spaces, there's the potential pollen problem too, although maybe a little bit less because with the green spaces are manicured lawns, you know, there's not a lot of pollen being produced in those situations. But these studies that have been coming out show, on balance, really substantial, actually, in many places, substantial health benefits. And nobody really understands yet what the mechanisms are. You know, one thing, a flip side also similar to what you just said about health is ecosystem services. We didn't really talk about ecosystem disservices, but there are also potentially disservices in terms of what the ecosystems are providing too. And so really, to be fair, you have to look at everything. You have to look at the negative and the positive.
So are you, Meg, just reminded me of this. There was a paper that came out that looked at the sort of ecosystem services derived from the Million Tree Initiative in LA. I would think that's what it was called.
Yeah, it is. I haven't seen the paper though.
And one of the issues they raised was exactly this, that pollens from or allergens created by the trees actually essentially eroded the net benefit that you would get, for example, from pollutant filtration in the air column, and so that at least from a health perspective, there was some problem. So there might be an analogy there. I don't know.
To me, I mean, that's perfect though in terms of what I'm saying about plant selection. So that would mean you should try to select the plants that are going to be less allergenic. Right? So that would just be one of the factors. But right now we can't do it because we don't even know what's good and what's bad, and we don't know how the balance is. But you know, in terms of directions where we should be moving, I think so. For me, being really in an urban area in Los Angeles, I appreciate how hard it is to sell green spaces and biofilters in the inner city, where what they're worried about is they're worried about jobs, right? They're not worried about um, pollinators or worms or anything like that. They're not really even worried about climate change or or even climate mitigation, amelioration, local climate. I mean, they're worried about jobs, but they also are worried about health. And so, the reason I'm mentioning it is because I think even just on the aesthetic side, I mean, there's a health benefit, there's a psychological, a mental health benefit from seeing those green spaces. And if you go to some of these places in the inner city, I mean, there's no green. LA is a very park poor place, and we're having a hard time getting like big parks because it's hard to get that space. But actually, biofilters, you can fit biofilters in, and you can infill and you can get green in there. And so I think that, and this is not just about plant selection, but it's a broader thing. But plant selection is part of that, getting the right plants that will fit in there, and potentially you could get health benefits, I think. So.
In sort of riffing off of that, that map of Ballona Creek out of the regional water management plan that you showed was really astonishing. What time frame are they thinking about implementing that over?
Yeah, decades, I would say. So what's happened, I mean, this is a different story, but it's for their MS4 permits. And they figured out this, I mean, they have come to an agreement over this planning process where they will plan out what has to be implemented that, according to models, say that it'll resolve the pollution problems. And so, but there's a pretty, I would say, a relatively relaxed or lenient implementation schedule. I mean, so doing the planning is very important. They have to do the planning now. But and just before, when you were talking about $10 billion, right, we're talking about very, very expensive plans. And so they don't expect the cities to implement them over, like 3 or 5 years. We're talking about 10 or maybe 20 years or something like that. But, that's really not that long.
Yeah, no, and it does also mean that the cautionary tales that you're seeing, for example, on Elmer Street, are extremely important to take into consideration, because if you start scaling up on that kind of massive scale, if these systems only last a couple of years and then die, that's an enormous embarrassment, if nothing else, I would think.
Yeah, and what it means, I mean, this is a potential flaw in the whole scheme with these EWIMPs, is that they're assuming that the plan is going to be implemented and the implementation is going to work as modeled. And so if the plants aren't right and the maintenance isn't right, then in 5 or 10 years, you could be back to where you were before you did this. But you could be thinking that you had solved the problem.
And after spending $10 billion.
Yeah, right, exactly. So don't want to do that.